November 18, 1944. A cold Wednesday evening at a makeshift prisoner of war facility outside Fort Meade, Massachusetts. In a sparse dining hall lit by harsh overhead bulbs, 57 German women sat frozen in their chairs, staring at the metal trays placed before them. The scene would have looked ordinary to any American observer, just another routine dinner service in a military facility. But to these women, members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps captured during the Allied advance through France, what lay on those trays defied everything they understood about war, captivity, and reality itself. Ilse Neumann, a 23-year-old former teacher from Berlin, gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. On her tray sat a thick slice of roasted pork, its surface glistening with rich brown gravy. Beside it, a generous portion of mashed potatoes crowned with a pat of real butter that was already beginning to melt into golden pools. Green beans, not the wilted scraps she remembered from home, but vibrant and plentiful. A slice of white bread, soft and fresh, accompanied by another pat of butter. And in a small bowl, apple compote that smelled of cinnamon and sugar. Next to her, Hannelore Steinberg, a 21-year-old seamstress from Leipzig, whispered in German, "Ilse, is this real? Are we meant to eat all of this?" Her voice carried a tremor of something between hope and fear, as if touching the food might make it vanish like a cruel mirage. Across the table, Ingeborg Lehmann, a 27-year-old pharmacist assistant from Hamburg, simply stared at her tray with tears streaming down her face. She made no sound, but her shoulders shook with silent sobs that she could not control. The youngest among them, 19-year-old Christa Bergman from Nuremberg, looked around the dining hall with wide, confused eyes. "Is it a holiday?" she asked. "Is it someone's birthday? Why would they give us this?" Her question hung in the air unanswered because none of them could fathom an explanation that made sense. In their experience, in the Germany they had left behind, food like this appeared only in memories of peacetime or in propaganda posters promising victory, certainly not on the plates of prisoners of war. Captain Margaret Sullivan stood near the doorway observing the scene with growing concern. She had anticipated many reactions to the prisoners' arrival: defiance, fear, anger, perhaps even relief. But this stunned silence, these tears, this visible disbelief at a standard military meal troubled her in ways she had not expected. She exchanged glances with Private Chester Drummond, a farm boy from Iowa who had been assigned to the facility just weeks earlier. His young face reflected his own confusion at the prisoners' reaction. "Ma'am," he whispered, "why aren't they eating? The food's getting cold." Captain Sullivan shook her head slowly, beginning to understand something profound about the women before her. "Private," she said quietly, "I don't think they believe it's real." 48 hours earlier, the 57 German women had stepped off a military transport ship at Boston Harbor, their first moments on American soil marked by November wind cutting through their worn auxiliary uniforms. They had spent 3 weeks crossing the Atlantic in the cargo hold of a converted freighter, sleeping on narrow bunks and surviving on meager rations that barely kept hunger at bay. The crossing had been rough, and many of them spent days too seasick to eat what little was offered. Now, standing on the dock with their few possessions clutched in small bags, they faced an uncertain future in a land they had been taught to view as the enemy. Ilse Neumann had kept a small notebook hidden in her jacket pocket throughout the journey, though she had nothing to write with anymore. She had been a teacher of literature in Berlin before joining the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943, believing she was serving her country's defense by working as a communications specialist. Now, at 23, she found herself a prisoner in a nation she knew only through propaganda films and official government statements. Everything she had been told about America painted it as a place of poverty and moral decay, where citizens struggled for basic necessities while their government waged an unjust war across Europe. The reality confronting her at Boston Harbor contradicted those teachings in subtle but unsettling ways. The American soldiers processing their arrival were efficient but not cruel. The dock workers going about their business looked well-fed and adequately clothed despite the country being at war. The vehicles that transported them inland appeared functional and maintained, not the desperate patchwork of failing machinery she had expected. These observations created small fissures in the foundation of everything she believed, though she tried to dismiss them as mere surface appearances. Hannelore Steinberg, the seamstress from Leipzig, noticed different details. Having worked with fabrics her entire life, she could not help but observe the quality of the American uniforms. The weave was tight and even, the material substantial, rather than the increasingly thin and recycled fabrics she had been working with in Germany for the past 2 years. Even the ordinary workers on the dock wore clothing that showed no signs of the desperate mending and make-do repairs that had become universal back home. It was a small thing, perhaps, but small things often revealed larger truths. When they arrived at the facility outside Fort Meade, after a 6-hour drive through the Massachusetts countryside, exhaustion had dulled their capacity for observation. Captain Sullivan met them at the gate, her bearing military, but her expression revealing something closer to concern than hostility. She addressed them in English, which Sergeant Daniel Castillo then translated into careful German. They would be housed in barracks, assigned work duties, and treated according to the Geneva Convention. What none of them understood yet was that their treatment would exceed those minimum standards in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew. To understand the women's reaction to that first meal, one must understand the hunger that had become their constant companion long before capture. Hannelore Steinberg's story was typical of what many of them had experienced in the final years of the war. In Leipzig, where she had worked as a seamstress in a factory producing military uniforms, the ration system had steadily deteriorated throughout 1943 and 1944. What began as modest restrictions evolved into a daily struggle for basic sustenance that consumed every thought and shaped every decision. Her official ration card entitled her to 250 grams of bread per day, though the bread itself had changed dramatically over the years. Real wheat flour had long since been replaced by a mixture that included sawdust, chestnuts, and whatever other fillers the bakers could incorporate while still producing something that held together enough to be called bread. It was gray, dense, and often caused stomach problems, but it was better than nothing. Her weekly allotment of meat had shrunk to 100 grams, usually in the form of sausage that bore only a distant relationship to actual meat. Fat, butter, and milk existed only in memory for most civilians by 1944. The ersatz coffee that had become universal throughout Germany was made from roasted acorns, chicory, and occasionally barley. It tasted nothing like real coffee, but it was hot, and gave the illusion of a proper breakfast. Hannelore had not tasted real coffee since 1941, and even then it had been mixed with substitutes to stretch the limited supply. Sugar had become so precious that mothers saved their tiny rations for weeks to bake a small cake for a child's birthday, using even that sparingly and substituting saccharin when possible. The constant hunger created a psychological state that was difficult for those who had never experienced it to understand. It was not the sharp, immediate hunger of missing a single meal, but a grinding, perpetual emptiness that never completely went away, even after eating. Hannellore's workdays at the uniform factory were punctuated by thoughts of food, memories of meals from before the war, and elaborate fantasies about what she would eat when the promised victory finally arrived and normal life resumed. Her co-workers engaged in the same mental exercises, sometimes spending entire lunch breaks describing in detail the Christmas dinners of their childhood, meals that now seemed impossibly luxurious. When she joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in early 1944, it was partly motivated by the promise of slightly better rations for those in military service. The additional 100 grams of bread per day and the possibility of occasional access to military kitchens made the decision practical, not just patriotic. By the time she was captured in France that October, she had lost nearly 15 kilograms from her already slender frame. The hunger had become so normalized that she no longer consciously registered it most of the time. It was simply the background condition of existence. The morning after their arrival brought the first true shock to their understanding of American captivity. Krista Bergman woke before dawn in the barracks, her internal clock still adjusted to the rigid schedule of her previous posting. At 19, she was the youngest among the prisoners, a telegraph operator from Nuremberg who had joined the auxiliary service straight from technical school. She had expected to be roused by harsh commands and marched to whatever labor the Americans had planned for them. Instead, she woke to relative quiet and the unprecedented luxury of being allowed to sleep until a reasonable hour. When a bell finally rang at 6:30 in the morning, the women rose and prepared themselves with the mechanical efficiency of military routine. They were directed to the same dining hall where they had received dinner the previous evening, though most of them had barely touched that meal, still uncertain whether it was real or some kind of psychological test. This morning, the uncertainty remained, but hunger had begun to override caution. They had not eaten properly in days, and their bodies were making demands their minds could not ignore. What awaited them at breakfast defied comprehension even more than dinner had. On each tray sat 2 fried eggs, their yolks golden and intact, 3 strips of bacon, crispy and fragrant, 2 slices of toast made from genuine white bread, accompanied by small containers of butter and strawberry jam, a portion of fried potatoes, and a cup of real coffee, black and strong, with small containers of cream and sugar available on each table. The quantity alone would have been shocking, but the quality made it almost obscene to women who had been surviving on ersatz coffee and bread that was more sawdust than grain. Ingeborg Lehmann, the pharmacist assistant from Hamburg, picked up her fork with trembling hands. At 27, she was older than many of the others and had clearer memories of life before the war's privations. She cut into one of the eggs, watching the yolk run across the plate in a rich yellow stream that seemed almost indecent in its abundance. She brought the fork to her mouth and closed her eyes as she tasted real egg for the first time in over 3 years. The flavor was so intense, so full of life, that she had to set down her fork and simply breathe for a moment to steady herself. Around her, similar scenes played out. Some women ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it might be their last. Others ate quickly, driven by a hunger so deep that even this generous portion barely seemed adequate. A few still could not bring themselves to eat, convinced that accepting American generosity represented some form of betrayal or that the food must be conditional on some demand they did not yet understand. Private Chester Drummond watched the German women eat their breakfast with growing confusion. The 20-year-old farm boy from Iowa had been raised on meals far more substantial than what these prisoners were receiving, and he genuinely could not understand their stunned reactions. To him, eggs and bacon represented a standard morning meal, nothing special or particularly generous. His mother prepared similar breakfasts every day for his family back home, often with even larger portions when his father and brothers needed fuel for a long day of farm work. During his brief orientation before the prisoners' arrival, Captain Sullivan had mentioned that the women might be malnourished and should be monitored for signs of illness. But Drummond had interpreted that as a general precaution, not as an indication that these women had been living on the edge of starvation. Now, watching them react to ordinary food with tears and trembling hands, he began to understand that something fundamental separated his experience of the world from theirs. The concept of daily abundance that he took for granted was apparently completely foreign to them. Sergeant Daniel Castillo, a 32-year-old Mexican-American from Texas, had a different perspective. His family had experienced genuine poverty during his childhood, and he remembered times when meals were sparse and uncertain. But even in those difficult years, his mother had managed to provide something substantial most days: beans, tortillas, whatever vegetables they could grow or afford. The hunger he remembered from childhood was occasional and temporary, not the grinding, constant deprivation that these German women's faces suggested they had endured for years. He approached Captain Sullivan after breakfast as the prisoners filed out to their barracks. "Ma'am, I don't think they believe this is normal. They think we're fattening them up for something, or that this is special treatment before interrogation." Sullivan nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I'm beginning to realize that, Sergeant. The intelligence reports mentioned food shortages in Germany, but seeing their reaction makes me wonder if we truly understood the scale of their deprivation." Dr. Howard Lindstrom, the camp's medical officer, had conducted preliminary health examinations of all the prisoners upon arrival. His findings troubled him deeply. Nearly every woman showed signs of prolonged malnutrition. Many had vitamin deficiencies visible in their skin and hair. Several had dental problems related to inadequate nutrition. Their average weight was significantly below what would be considered healthy for their heights and ages. These were not women who had experienced a few weeks of reduced rations during transport. These were women whose bodies bore the evidence of years of inadequate food. He shared his observations with Captain Sullivan that afternoon. "Margaret, if we continue feeding them standard military rations, we need to do it gradually. Their digestive systems may not be able to handle rich foods immediately after prolonged deprivation. We should start with smaller portions and work up to normal servings over a few weeks." Sullivan agreed, though she realized this created an unusual situation. They would need to deliberately give prisoners less food than regulations required, not as punishment but as medical necessity. That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Hannelore Steinberg lay in her narrow bunk and allowed herself to remember bread. Real bread. The kind she had known as a child in Leipzig before the war transformed everything. Her father had owned a small bakery, and she had grown up surrounded by the smell of yeast and flour, watching him work with an artisan's pride to create loaves that satisfied both eye and palate. Those memories had sustained her through years of eating the gray, dense substitute that barely deserved the name. She remembered being 7 years old, standing on a stool in her father's bakery, watching him knead dough with strong, practiced movements. He would let her help sometimes, her small hands pressing into the soft, elastic mass while he guided her movements. "Feel how it comes alive under your hands, Hannelore," he would say. "Good bread is not just flour and water. It is patience and respect for the process." The loaves that emerged from his ovens were golden and crusty, with interiors so light and tender that they seemed to melt on the tongue. By 1939, when she was 16, her father's recipes had already begun to change. Regulations required bakers to add potato flour to stretch the wheat supplies. The resulting bread was heavier, denser, but still recognizable as proper bread. Her father adapted, learning to work with the mandated mixtures while still producing something he could be proud of. But each year brought new restrictions, new substitutes, new compromises with quality that troubled him deeply. In 1941, the bakery closed. There was no longer enough flour allocated to small independent bakers. The government directed all grain to large industrial bakeries that could produce the maximum quantity with the minimum ingredients. Her father found work in one of these facilities, but he came home each evening looking defeated, ashamed of what he was forced to create. The bread they produced was gray-brown, studded with visible chunks of sawdust and wood pulp held together more by desperate chemistry than by any natural process. Hannelore had eaten that bread for 3 years before joining the auxiliary service. She had forced it down despite the way it sat heavy in her stomach, despite how it sometimes caused cramps and digestive problems. She had eaten it because the alternative was hunger, and hunger was worse. She had watched her mother slice it thin to make the ration last longer, had seen her younger brother cry because he was still hungry, After finishing his portion, had learned to chew each bite thoroughly to extract maximum satisfaction from minimum substance. The white bread she had been served at breakfast that morning was so far beyond those memories that it seemed to exist in a different reality entirely. Soft, light, with a subtle sweetness that came from actual wheat flour and perhaps a touch of milk. When she had spread butter on it, real butter, not the rancid fat substitute they had been using in Germany, she had experienced something close to grief for all the years of deprivation, for her father's lost pride, for the simple pleasure of good bread that had been stolen from an entire nation. On their third day at the facility, Ingeborg Lehmann and 5 other women were assigned to kitchen duty. Captain Sullivan had decided that giving the prisoners productive work would help with their adjustment and provide a sense of purpose. Ingeborg approached the assignment with mixed feelings. Her training as a pharmacist assistant had made her comfortable with precise measurements and procedures, but she had never been particularly skilled at cooking. In recent years, cooking had been less about skill and more about making something edible from inadequate ingredients. When Sergeant Castillo led them to the kitchen that morning, Ingeborg expected to see a military facility similar to what she had known in Germany, efficient, sterile, operating on minimal supplies, stretched to their absolute limit. Instead, she walked into a space that seemed designed for abundance. Industrial stoves and ovens, all functioning properly, multiple refrigeration units humming steadily, work surfaces that were clean and well-maintained. But it was what came next that truly shocked her. Castillo opened the door to the storage room and gestured for them to follow. The space was perhaps 10 meters long and 5 meters wide, lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, and those shelves were full. Cans of vegetables, fruits, and meats stacked in neat rows that seemed to go on forever. Sacks of flour, sugar, and rice piled against one wall, crates of fresh potatoes and onions, boxes of pasta and dried beans. The quantity would have fed her entire neighborhood in Hamburg for months, yet this was apparently just the normal stock for a small military facility housing fewer than 100 people. One of the other women, Adelheid Schneider, made a small sound of distress and reached out to steady herself against a shelf. Ingeborg understood the feeling. The contrast between this abundance and the empty shelves of German shops was so extreme that it created a kind of cognitive dissonance. How could both realities exist simultaneously in the same world? How could Americans have so much while Germans had so little, and yet Germany was supposedly winning the war? The American cook, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Corporal James Whitney, noticed their reactions and misinterpreted them. "I know it doesn't look like much," he said through Castillo's translation. "We're actually running a bit low this week. Shipment was delayed, but we'll get restocked in a few days." Running low. Ingeborg wanted to laugh or cry, or both. This kitchen had more food than she had seen in one place since before the war began, and the cook was apologizing for shortage. He began explaining their duties, showing them how to prepare vegetables for the lunch meal. The task itself was simple enough, but Ingeborg found herself struggling with the quantities. He wanted them to peel 20 kilograms of potatoes, 20 kilograms, for one meal, for fewer than 100 people. In Germany, that amount of potatoes would have been rationed across multiple families for a week. Here, it was just lunch on an ordinary Thursday. That evening, Captain Sullivan distributed writing materials to any prisoners who wished to send letters home. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be allowed to correspond with their families, though all letters would be read by censors before being sent. Ilse Neumann sat at one of the long tables in the common room, staring at the blank paper before her with growing frustration. She wanted desperately to write to her parents in Berlin to let them know she was alive and unharmed. But how could she describe her current reality without sounding delusional? She picked up the pencil and began to write in careful German script. "Dear Mama and Papa, I am well and unharmed. The Americans are treating us according to international law. We have adequate shelter and—" She paused, the pencil hovering over the paper. Adequate shelter seemed like a lie. They had real beds with clean mattresses, blankets that were whole and warm, barracks that were heated against the November cold. The word adequate felt like a betrayal of the truth, but how could she write the actual truth? How could she tell them that she was more comfortable now than she had been in Berlin? The food presented an even greater problem. She knew that if she wrote honestly about what they were being fed, her parents would think she was lying or that she had been brainwashed by propaganda. They would not believe that prisoners were eating eggs and bacon for breakfast, roasted meat for dinner, real coffee with actual cream and sugar. They would think she was either deceiving them or had been deceived herself. And even if they did believe her, what would that knowledge do to them? Would it give them comfort to know she was eating well, or would it cause pain knowing that their daughter was fed while they went hungry? Around her, other women struggled with similar difficulties. Krista had started and discarded 3 different letters, unable to find words that felt both true and acceptable. Hannelore had written a single sentence, "I am alive and thinking of you always," and then sat staring at it, unable to continue. How could she write about the bread? How could she explain that she had cried at breakfast because the toast reminded her of Father's bakery before everything changed? Rosemarie Klein, a former clerk from Dresden, attempted a different approach. She wrote about the weather, about the New England landscape visible from the barracks windows, about the other women and how they were coping with captivity. She filled her letter with neutral observations that revealed nothing of substance. When Ilse read over her shoulder, she recognized it as the safest option, but also the most dishonest. They were living through something significant, something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the world. And all they could safely write home about was weather and landscape. The real letter, the one Ilse wanted to write but never could, lived only in her mind. Dear Mama and Papa, everything we were told was a lie. The Americans are not starving, they are not desperate. They have so much food that they feed their prisoners better than our soldiers are fed. I don't understand how this is possible. Sunday, November 26, 1944. The day that would become legend among the 57 German women prisoners began like any other. They rose at 6:30, attended to their morning routines, and gathered for breakfast with a mixture of anticipation and residual disbelief that had characterized their first week in captivity. But when they entered the dining hall for the midday meal that Sunday, they encountered something that transcended even their expanding understanding of American abundance. The smell hit them first, rich, savory, the unmistakable aroma of roasting meat that carried memories of Christmas dinners and birthday celebrations from a world that seemed to have existed in a different lifetime. Private Drummond and 2 other guards were setting the tables with unusual care, and Ilse noticed immediately that something about this meal was different. There were extra plates, cloth napkins instead of paper, and the tables had been arranged in a more formal configuration than usual. When the kitchen staff began bringing out the food, the women simply stared. Each plate held a thick slice of pork roast, the meat tender and juicy, topped with rich brown gravy that pooled around the edges. Beside it, a generous mound of mashed potatoes, whipped until they were light and fluffy, with a pat of butter melting into a golden crater at the center. Carrots and green beans, cooked until tender but still vibrant in color. A separate plate held 2 slices of white bread, and small bowls of applesauce accompanied each setting. Krista Bergman looked around the dining hall with wide, confused eyes. "Is it Easter?" she whispered to Ilse. "Did we lose track of the days? Is this a holiday?" Her question was not absurd. In Germany, such a meal would appear only on the most significant religious holidays, and even then, only in households wealthy enough to access black market supplies. The idea that this could be ordinary Sunday dinner defied everything she understood about how the world worked. Ingeborg sat down slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She had been managing relatively well with the daily meals, accepting them as some kind of strange American protocol she did not fully understand. but this exceeded her capacity to rationalize. The portion of meat on her plate was larger than her entire family's weekly ration back in Hamburg. The butter alone represented more fat than she had consumed in the previous month before capture. It was not just generous, it was excessive to the point of being obscene. Hannelore picked up her fork and knife, but found herself unable to begin cutting the meat. Tears streamed down her face, and she made no effort to wipe them away. She was remembering her father's bakery, her family's Sunday dinners before the war, the simple abundance that had once been normal and had gradually been stripped away until even the memory of it seemed like a fantasy. And now here she was, an enemy prisoner, being served food that would have made her family weep with joy and disbelief. Captain Sullivan stood at the entrance to the dining hall, watching the scene unfold with Dr. Lindstrom beside her. "They think it's a special occasion," she said quietly. "They don't understand that this is just Sunday dinner." The doctor nodded, his expression troubled. "Margaret, we need to help them understand. This cognitive dissonance between what they've experienced and what they're experiencing now is creating psychological stress. They need to grasp that this is genuinely normal here, or they'll never be able to process what it means." That night, Ilse Neumann lay awake long after the lights had been turned off in the barracks. The pork roast dinner had broken something loose in her mind, some barrier that had been holding back questions she had not allowed herself to fully consider. If the Americans could feed their prisoners this well, what did that say about the state of their nation? If this abundance was real and sustainable, what did it mean about everything she had been told about American society? The German government's propaganda had painted a consistent picture of America as a failing nation, crippled by economic depression, torn apart by racial conflict, starving its own citizens while waging an unjust war across two oceans. The newsreels she had seen in Berlin showed breadlines and poverty, desperate Americans struggling for survival. Her instructors in the Women's Auxiliary Corps had assured her that America's entry into the war was an act of desperation, that their industrial capacity was a myth, that their soldiers were poorly equipped and supplied. But none of that matched what she was observing. The guards were well-fed, healthy, their uniforms quality and well-maintained. The facility itself, though simple, was sturdy and properly heated. The food was not just adequate, but abundant. The medical care was professional and attentive. Every physical detail of her captivity contradicted the narrative she had accepted about American society, which meant either the propaganda had been false or this treatment was an elaborate deception designed for some purpose she did not yet understand. She thought about the other things she had been told with such certainty, that the war was purely defensive, that Germany was protecting itself and its allies from encirclement, that the reports of violence against Jewish citizens were exaggerated enemy propaganda, that the camps in the East were simply relocation centers for displaced populations, that German forces were liberating occupied territories rather than subjugating them. How many of those certainties were as false as the claims about American starvation? Across the dark barracks, she heard quiet crying. She was not the only one lying awake with uncomfortable questions. The Sunday pork roast had been a breaking point for many of them. It was one thing to accept surprisingly adequate treatment as a temporary anomaly or a strategic choice by their captors. It was another thing entirely to confront abundance so extreme that it suggested their entire understanding of the war's context was fundamentally wrong. Ingeborg's voice came softly through the darkness. "Ilse, are you awake?" When Ilse confirmed that she was, Ingeborg continued in a whisper, "I've been thinking about the storage room. The amount of food we saw would feed my entire apartment building for months, and the cook said they were running low. What if everything we were told about America was false? What does that mean about everything else we were told?" The question hung in the darkness, unanswered, because there was no answer that did not require them to reconsider their entire understanding of reality. If their government had lied about something as verifiable as American economic conditions, what else had been lies? And if so much had been false, Who were they really? What had they actually been serving when they put on their auxiliary uniforms and pledged to defend the Reich? As the women's bodies began to respond to adequate nutrition, a new kind of suffering emerged that was entirely psychological. Ingeborg found herself gaining weight, her face filling out, her clothes fitting differently. Her reflection in the small mirror in the barracks washroom showed a healthier woman than had existed 6 months earlier. And with that physical improvement came crushing guilt that kept her awake at night and made every meal a moral struggle. Her family was still in Hamburg. Her mother, her younger sister, her grandmother. The last letter she had received before her capture, back in September, had mentioned that the ration situation was worsening. Her mother had written about the difficulty of finding even the inadequate substitutes that had become their staples. She had mentioned that her sister, who was 14, had fainted at school from hunger. And now here was Ingeborg eating bacon and eggs for breakfast, gaining weight, her body recovering its health, while her family continued to starve. The shame of it was almost unbearable. She felt like a traitor to her family, to her country, to the people suffering back home. Every bite of food tasted like betrayal. She tried eating less, tried refusing portions, but Dr. Lindstrom noticed and insisted that she maintain adequate nutrition. He did not understand that her body's improvement felt like a moral failing, that gaining weight while her loved ones grew thinner seemed like the worst kind of selfishness. Hannelore struggled with similar guilt, though hers was compounded by a different kind of shame. She found herself looking forward to meals. After weeks of regular, abundant food, her body had begun to trust that more would come. The constant anxiety about hunger that had defined her existence for years was gradually fading. And that relief felt like a betrayal of everyone still suffering. How could she feel grateful to her captors? How could she experience comfort while Germany burned? The other women wrestled with their own versions of this guilt. Some tried to save portions of food, an impulse from years of scarcity, only to be told by the guards that hoarding was unnecessary because there would always be more. That assurance, meant to be comforting, only highlighted the vast gap between their current reality and the reality their families inhabited. They were living in abundance while their loved ones suffered, and the fact that they had no choice in the matter did not make the guilt any lighter. Krista approached Ilse one evening with a question that revealed the depth of their moral confusion. Is it wrong to be grateful? I find myself thanking Private Drummond when he brings extra bread. I feel grateful to Captain Sullivan for treating us well. But should I feel grateful to the enemy? Doesn't that make me disloyal? Ilse had no answer because she was wrestling with the same question. Gratitude and loyalty seemed to be in direct conflict, and there was no clear moral path through that conflict. The psychological toll of this guilt manifested in various ways. Some women became withdrawn and melancholy. Others threw themselves into their work duties with almost frantic energy, as if productivity could somehow balance the equation of their unearned comfort. A few refused to acknowledge the contradiction entirely, maintaining rigid adherence to their previous beliefs despite mounting evidence against them. But most existed in a state of uncomfortable awareness, unable to resolve the tension between their body's relief and their conscience's accusations. Private Chester Drummond had been raised on a farm outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in a family that valued hard work, faith, and practical common sense. At 20 years old, he had never traveled more than 100 miles from home before joining the Army 6 months earlier. His worldview had been shaped by the rhythms of agricultural life, by the Depression-era values of his parents, and by a fundamental belief in American abundance that he had never thought to question because he had never known anything different. His family's farm was modest by Iowa standards, 160 acres of corn and soybeans, with a small dairy operation that his father maintained with the help of Chester and his 2 brothers. They were not wealthy, but they had always had enough. Enough food, enough clothing, enough of the basic necessities that made life comfortable. His mother's kitchen had been the center of their home, always warm, always filled with the smells of cooking, always producing meals that satisfied both body and soul. When he had been assigned to guard duty at the prisoner facility, he had approached it as just another job, something he would do competently until the war ended and he could return to Iowa and the farm that would someday be partially his. He had not expected to feel sympathy for enemy prisoners, had not anticipated that their circumstances would challenge his understanding of the world. But watching the German women react to ordinary food with tears and disbelief had opened his eyes to realities he had never considered. He found himself talking with Sergeant Castillo about it one afternoon during a break. "Sarge, I don't understand how they could have been that hungry. Germany's supposed to be this powerful nation, this great military force. How could they not be feeding their own people?" Castillo, who had more education and more experience with the world's complexities, tried to explain about total war economies, about resource allocation, about how militarization could coexist with civilian deprivation, but the concept still troubled Drummond. In America, even during the Depression, when his family had struggled, they had never gone truly hungry. There had been government programs, community support, the natural abundance of agricultural land that produced more than enough to feed the population. The idea that an advanced European nation could systematically starve its citizens while waging war across multiple continents seemed both incomprehensible and deeply wrong to him. He began making small efforts to help the women understand American life, hoping that knowledge might ease their psychological distress. During his guard shifts, he would talk to those who spoke some English about his family's farm. He described his mother's kitchen, the Sunday dinners after church, the harvest meals when neighbors came together to help bring in the crops. He talked about the grocery stores in Cedar Rapids, about how you could walk in with enough money and walk out with more food than you could carry. Ilsa became his most frequent conversation partner. Her English was improving rapidly, and she seemed hungry for information about ordinary American life. "Tell me about your mother's garden," she would ask, and he would describe the rows of tomatoes and beans, the potato patch, the berry bushes that produced fruit every summer. To him, these were mundane details. To her, they were evidence of an entire way of life built on assumptions about abundance that she was only beginning to comprehend. Thursday, November 23, 1944. Thanksgiving Day. The German women had heard the American staff discussing this holiday for several days, but none of them truly understood what it meant. Captain Sullivan had decided that including the prisoners in the Thanksgiving observance might help them better understand American culture and values. What she did not anticipate was how the holiday itself would become another profound lesson in the gap between their two worlds. The dining hall had been decorated with autumn leaves, cornstalks, and small pumpkins that Private Drummond and others had gathered from local farms. Long tables had been arranged in a U-shape, and for the first time since their arrival, the prisoners would be eating alongside the American staff rather than separately. Captain Sullivan stood at the head of the main table and explained through Sergeant Castillo's translation what Thanksgiving represented. "This is a day when Americans gather to give thanks for our blessings," she said. "We remember the first harvest celebration between the Pilgrims and the native peoples. We acknowledge the abundance we have been given and express gratitude for it." The concept of a holiday specifically dedicated to celebrating abundance struck the German women as almost incomprehensible. In their experience, holidays were either religious observances or nationalistic celebrations of military victories. The idea of an entire national holiday focused on gratitude for having enough seemed to come from a completely different understanding of what life should be. The meal itself exceeded even the Sunday pork roast in its abundance. Roasted turkey, multiple birds to ensure everyone could have generous portions, mashed potatoes and gravy, sweet potatoes with brown sugar and butter, green bean casserole, stuffing fragrant with herbs, cranberry sauce, fresh bread rolls, and for dessert, both pumpkin pie and apple pie with real whipped cream. The quantity of food on display would have fed the entire compound for days, yet this was apparently traditional for a single meal. Hannelore sat at her place and felt her composure finally break completely. She put her face in her hands and sobbed, her shoulders shaking with the release of weeks of accumulated emotion. This was not just food. This was a celebration of abundance, a ritual affirmation that having plenty was normal and expected. It was a value system so fundamentally different from what she had known that it made her previous life seem not just difficult, but somehow wrong in its basic assumptions about how the world worked. Ingeborg reached over and took her hand, but tears were streaming down her own face as well. Around the tables, other women struggled with similar emotions. Some cried openly, others sat rigid and silent, clearly overwhelmed. A few, including Krista, seemed to have moved beyond shock into a kind of numb acceptance that this was simply how Americans lived. Private Drummond noticed their distress and spoke to Captain Sullivan quietly. "Ma'am, should we have done something different? I think this is too much for them." Sullivan shook her head. "No, Private. They needed to see this. They needed to understand that this abundance is real and that we consider it worth celebrating. They're crying because their entire understanding of the world is changing." By mid-December, the physical changes in the prisoners had become undeniable. Dr. Lindstrom conducted follow-up health examinations and found that, on average, the women had gained between 3 and 7 kilograms since their arrival. Their hair had begun to show more luster, their skin looked healthier, and the vitamin deficiency symptoms he had noted initially were resolving. From a medical perspective, the transformation was exactly what he had hoped for. From a psychological perspective, it was creating profound distress. Hannelore stood in front of the small mirror in the washroom, examining her reflection with a mixture of relief and horror. Her face had filled out, the gaunt hollows in her cheeks disappearing as her body recovered from years of inadequate nutrition. Her arms no longer looked skeletal, and her clothing had begun to feel snug rather than hanging loose on her frame. She looked healthier than she had in years, and that fact filled her with shame so intense it was almost physical. She thought about her younger brother back in Leipzig. Hans was 16 now, still growing, his body demanding nutrients it was not receiving. He had written in his last letter about being hungry all the time, about how the rations never seemed like enough. And here she was, putting on weight, her body recovering and strengthening, while his continued to suffer. The injustice of it seemed monstrous, and the fact that she had no control over the situation did not make it feel any less like betrayal. Krista had a different reaction to her physical changes. At 19, she had been barely more than a girl when captured, her body still carrying the lean angularity of adolescence. Now, with proper nutrition, she was developing the fuller figure of young womanhood. Her body was becoming what it should have been all along if the war had not intervened. But this normal development felt abnormal because it was happening in captivity, fed by enemy generosity rather than by her own family's care. Ilse noticed that some of the women were trying to exercise excessively, as if they could burn away the evidence of their improved nutrition through physical activity. Others had returned to attempting to eat less, though Dr. Lindstrom continued to monitor their intake and intervene when he thought someone was deliberately restricting themselves. The psychological complexity of their situation defied easy resolution. Their bodies were healing, which should have been unambiguously good, but the context made it feel like moral failure. The American staff struggled to understand this reaction. Private Drummond could not comprehend why gaining healthy weight would cause distress. To him, the women's recovery was simply natural and good. Sergeant Castillo, with his broader understanding of deprivation, grasped the guilt aspect but found it difficult to address. How could you tell someone not to feel guilty about surviving when their loved ones were still suffering? What comfort could you offer that would not sound hollow or dismissive? Captain Sullivan brought the issue up with Dr. Lindstrom during one of their regular consultations. The physical recovery is creating psychological problems we did not anticipate. They feel like they're betraying their families by getting healthier. Lindstrom nodded slowly. It's a form of survivor's guilt, Margaret. They're experiencing improvement while knowing others are not. The solution is not to keep them malnourished out of misplaced solidarity, but we need to help them understand that their recovery does not cause their families suffering. One cold December afternoon, Sergeant Castillo organized an informal educational session for any prisoners interested in learning about American agricultural systems. He had noticed their continued confusion about how such abundance was possible and thought that factual information might help them process their experiences. 12 women attended, including Ilsa, Ingeborg, and Hannelore, their curiosity overcoming their reluctance to engage too deeply with their captors. Castillo began by explaining the basic geography and climate of the American heartland. The vast prairies of the Midwest, the fertile river valleys, the long growing seasons that characterized much of agricultural America. He showed them a map, pointing out states like Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, states they had never thought much about, but which apparently produced grain in quantities that seemed almost fantastical. Private Drummond assisted, sharing details about his family's farm and how mechanization had changed American agriculture. The numbers Castillo cited seemed impossible to the women. America, with a population only somewhat larger than Germany's, produced more than twice the grain, 3 times the meat, and vastly more of almost every other agricultural product. Even accounting for America's larger land area, the productivity per acre was higher due to better soil, better equipment, better farming practices, and importantly, a system that prioritized food production for domestic consumption rather than subordinating everything to military needs. Ingeborg asked the question that had been troubling all of them. But we were told that America was suffering from food shortages, that your people were going hungry while you shipped food to Britain and Russia. Was that all false? Castillo chose his words carefully. America has rationing, yes. Certain items are restricted to support the war effort, but our rationing means you might not be able to buy as much butter as you want, or you might need to use coupons for meat. It does not mean going hungry. The distinction was crucial and devastating. American rationing meant mild inconvenience and slightly reduced variety. German rationing meant systematic starvation of the civilian population to maintain military operations. The gap between these two realities was so vast that it fundamentally challenged everything the women understood about their nation's strength and their leaders' priorities. If Germany was truly the powerful nation they had been told it was, why could it not feed its people adequately? Dr. Lindstrom, who had joined the session, added medical context. Malnutrition of the type you all showed when you arrived does not happen overnight. It takes years of inadequate nutrition to create those symptoms. Your government made choices about resource allocation that prioritized military expansion over feeding its population. January 5, 1945, nearly 2 months since their arrival at Fort Meade. The accumulation of daily experiences with American abundance had created an undeniable weight of evidence that could no longer be rationalized away or dismissed as temporary anomaly. For Ilse Newman, the breaking point came not during a dramatic moment, but during an ordinary breakfast on an unremarkable winter morning. She sat at the dining table, eating scrambled eggs and toast, drinking real coffee with cream, and suddenly, the entire framework of her previous beliefs simply collapsed. It was not a gradual erosion, but a sudden structural failure, like a building that had been weakened over time, finally giving way all at once. Everything she had been taught about America was false, which meant everything she had been taught about the war was suspect, which meant everything she had believed about her own country's righteousness was open to question. The realization was not liberating, it was terrifying. If the foundation of your understanding of the world proves false, what do you stand on? If the authorities you trusted were lying about something as basic and verifiable as American living conditions, what else had they lied about? The concentration camps that were being whispered about, the treatment of occupied populations, the justifications for the war itself, all of it became questionable. She set down her coffee cup with a hand that trembled slightly. Across the table, Ingeborg was watching her with an expression that suggested she recognized what was happening. "When did you know?" Ilse asked quietly in German. "When did you realize that everything was false?" Ingeborg did not need to ask what she meant. 3 weeks ago. I was helping in the medical office, and Dr. Lindstrom was explaining American public health systems. And I realized that my government had been systematically lying to me. Around them, other women were having similar reckonings at different paces. Some had arrived at this understanding earlier, some were still resisting it, and some would probably never fully accept it. But for those who did confront the truth of their deception, the psychological impact was profound. They were not just prisoners of war. They were prisoners of a lie that had shaped their entire understanding of reality. Hannelore joined their quiet conversation, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father used to say that you could judge a nation by how it treated ordinary people in ordinary times, by whether it valued their well-being or saw them as resources to be consumed. I did not understand what he meant then. I think he was trying to warn me about what our government was becoming." Krista spoke with the bluntness of youth. "So we were the villains? We thought we were defending our homeland, but actually we were serving evil?" The question hung heavy in the morning air. Ilse wanted to offer some nuanced response, but she could not find words that would be both honest and comforting. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had consumed the continent for nearly 6 years had finally ended with Germany's unconditional surrender. In cities across America, people celebrated in the streets with joy and relief. At the prisoner facility outside Fort Meade, the mood was far more complex and conflicted. For the 57 German women, the end of the war meant confronting a question they had been avoiding for months. What happened now? Captain Sullivan called a general assembly to explain the repatriation process. The women gathered in the main hall with faces that reflected months of profound internal struggle. She explained that arrangements were being made to return prisoners of war to Germany, that they would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe, that they would be released to return to whatever remained of their homes and families. The information was delivered with compassion, but also with bureaucratic straightforwardness. But nothing about their situation felt natural or standard anymore. Ilse sat listening to Captain Sullivan's words and felt a growing sense of dread. Return to what? The Germany she had left no longer existed. The letters she had finally been able to send and receive had painted a picture of devastation. Berlin was in ruins. Her family's apartment building had been destroyed in bombing raids. Her father was missing, probably dead. Her mother and younger sister had fled to her aunt's farm in Bavaria. What could she offer them? If she returned, she would be another mouth to feed in a country that had no food, another person needing shelter when there was no housing, another displaced soul in a nation of displaced souls, all struggling to survive in the rubble of their destroyed cities and destroyed beliefs. And she would bring with her knowledge that would make her suspect. She had spent 6 months in American captivity, had been treated well, had learned that everything they were told was lies. Hannelore was thinking along similar lines. She had received word that her father's bakery no longer existed, destroyed in the same bombing raid that had killed him. Her mother was living with relatives in the countryside. If Hannelore returned, she would have no employment, no prospects, no way to contribute meaningfully to her family's survival. The skills she had developed as a seamstress were useless in a world without fabric or thread. Ingeborg's situation was perhaps the most painful. Her family in Hamburg had survived physically, but the letters she received revealed people so broken by years of deprivation that she hardly recognized them. Her mother wrote about neighbors who had committed suicide, about friends who had lost their minds. Her younger sister, now 17, wrote with a bitterness that seemed alien in someone so young. The question they all faced was not simply whether to return to Germany, but whether there was a Germany worth returning to. The physical nation still existed on maps, but the country they had believed in had been revealed as either a lie or a corpse. They would be returning to a land they no longer understood, to rebuild something they no longer believed in. 25 years later. January 1970. Ilse Neumann, now Ilse Henderson, stood in her kitchen in Worcester, Massachusetts, preparing Sunday dinner for her family. Her husband, Thomas Henderson, a veteran who had served in the Pacific Theater, was reading the newspaper in the living room. Her two children, Margaret and Robert, were doing homework at the kitchen table. It was an ordinary American scene, comfortable and mundane, and Ilse still sometimes could not quite believe it was her life. She had chosen to stay in America after the war. It had not been an easy decision, and it had taken months of paperwork, sponsorship arrangements, and bureaucratic navigation. Mrs. Constance Sheffield, the community organizer who had befriended her during captivity, had helped her secure employment as a translator and eventually sponsored her immigration. Ilse had worked for the State Department for 15 years, helping process displaced persons from Europe, using her unique perspective to bridge cultural and linguistic gaps. The pork roast in her oven, the abundance in her refrigerator, the comfortable home she lived in, all of it still sometimes triggered memories of that first meal in November 1944. The shock, the disbelief, the way that simple plate of food had begun, the process of dismantling everything she thought she knew about the world. Food had been the teacher that propaganda could not overcome. You could dismiss words as lies, but you could not dismiss the evidence of your own body being nourished. Hannelore had also stayed, though her path had been different. She had found work in a textile factory, married an American soldier she met through church, and raised 3 children. She and Ilse remained close friends, bound by shared experience that no one else could fully understand. They met for coffee once a week, and sometimes they would talk about those days in captivity, about how food had taught them what their government had hidden. Ingeborg had returned to Germany after much agonizing. She felt she owed it to her family to try, to offer what help she could in rebuilding. But she had returned changed, carrying with her an understanding of what was possible when a society valued human dignity. She had become a nurse in Hamburg, working in community health, and her letters to Ilse spoke of slow progress, of gradual healing, of a Germany learning to become something different. Of the original 57 women, 32 had returned to Germany, and 25 had remained in America. Both groups carried forward the lessons learned during those months of captivity. The women who returned became advocates for truth and honest confrontation of their nation's past. The women who stayed became living examples of redemption and integration. Ilse called her family to dinner, setting out the roast with its accompanying dishes. Her children attacked the meal with typical teenage enthusiasm, taking for granted the abundance that their mother would never take for granted. Thomas noticed her expression and reached over to squeeze her hand. He knew her history, knew that every comfortable meal still carried echoes of transformation and gratitude. She smiled at him, grateful for a life built on truth rather than propaganda, on abundance rather than artificial scarcity. The pork roast had taught her more than any political speech ever could.